When speaking of states, it is important to bear in mind that a state is an artificial construct, and as such does not have a right to anything, including a right to exist. That being said, the constituent inhabitants of a state certainly have a right to struggle for existence, and to that end often form states to organize themselves. Rather than ruminating over what role a state has or whether it has one ought to examine the nature of its existence. The American Empire and its residents are no exception. Because the United States of America does in fact exist, arguing over whether its existence is right is pointless. Enquiry into the nature of its existence, its role, be it as a force for good, for ill, or be it ambivalent, and whether it has the potential to be of benefit to man both at home and abroad, is a far more useful examination. Marcus Tullius Cicero wrote that the administration of the government, like the office of a trustee, must be conducted for the benefit of those entrusted to one's care, not of those to whom it is entrusted. Now, those who care for the interests of a part of the citizens and neglect another part introduce into the civil service a dangerous element: dissension and party strife. The result is that some are found to be loyal supporters of the Democratic, others of the aristocratic party, and few of the nation as a whole. This passage from the grandfather of statecraft is a reasonable standard by which to assess a state and its struggles. That is, does it deliver for the people? Is it to rule for the people or for a specific elect clique? Unfortunately, rule of the American government is almost entirely on behalf of a small handful of extremely wealthy families and well-connected interests. According to Martin Gielens and Benjamin Page of Princeton and Northwest universities, who had conducted a study on representation in government, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the president's preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So the state, at its baseline, is in practice not representative of the people, but is an oligarchy in both the Hobbesian definition of the tyranny of the few and the Aristotelian definition of a perverted form of aristocracy, which emerges through the vice of the rulers, who, instead of distributing public property and honors according to merit, take all or most of the good things for themselves, and give the offices away to the same people, setting the greatest store by wealth. You have then a small number of bad men in power in place of the best men. This, of course, has extremely deleterious consequences for the people in the United States, for, as regards the plutocrats on whose behalf the state rules, Gielens and Page argued, how much do they know about the human impact of Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, or unemployment insurance, none of which is likely to be crucial to their own well-being? Most important, we see no reason to think that informational expertise is always accompanied by an inclination to transcend one's own interests or a determination to work for the common good. These issues are not merely the speculations of doomsayers. Vast swaths of the United States could rightfully be considered a part of the Third World. In the Mississippi River Delta, for example, Ruth Cummins of the University of Mississippi's Medical Center found that overall access to health care is still abysmal, keeping the Delta's high rates of diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and obesity among the worst in the nation. Employment prospects remain dismal. Schools are dilapidated and receive rock-bottom ratings from the Mississippi Department of Education. Economic development remains a constant struggle. Thousands still live in what's called a food desert, communities with no grocery store and little or no access to fresh fruits and vegetables. They live with food insecurity, which means they're unsure where their next meal will come from. Mississippi leads the nation in food insecurity, with 22% affected, much of it in the Delta. Other scourges faced by the people of the United States are tied to this poverty and lack of representation. The country has 2,121,600 languishing in its prisons. more than India and big bad communist China combined, the two countries which together constitute a third of the world's population. It has many times more prisoners than big bad Russia. In terms of proportion to its population, the United States has a higher rate of imprisonment than any other country in the world. 655 out of every 100,000 American residents are prisoners. Russia's rate is nearly half that of the United States at 383 per 100,000. While this data for China and India was not even represented by The Economist, as they're not on its list of the 30 countries with the highest per capita incarceration rate. Of course, this is not something that largely affects the wealthy, as a recent analysis published by Brookings shows that boys who grew up in families in the bottom 10% of the economic distribution, families earning less than about $14,000, are 20 times more likely to be in prison on a given day in their early 30s than children born to the wealthiest families, those earning more than $143,000. Almost 1 in 10 boys to the lowest income families are incarcerated at age 30 and make up about 27% of prisoners at that age. Furthermore, there are interest groups which work to keep as many incarcerated as possible, and not always for malevolent reasons. For according to David Liebert, in every state, the Prison Guards Union is a leading financial donor to electoral campaigns and an active lobbyist for certain penal policies. Now, men wanting to stay employed is not a terrible thing, even if the means at which they are employed is a bit warped. Yet at the same time, Liebert found that the private prison industry's lobbyists' agenda is in complete contrast to that of the majority of Americans who are in support of criminal justice reform. Companies such as the Corrections Corporation of America lobby for harsher sentences that once again benefit all who invest in them, increasing their profits. Cicero would argue that if punishment or correction must be administered, it need not be insulting. It ought to have regard for the welfare of the state, not to the personal satisfaction of the man who administers the punishment or reproof. We should take care also that the punishment shall not be out of proportion to the offense, and that some shall not be chastised for the same fault, for which others are not even called to account. In administering punishment, it is above all necessary to allow no trace of anger. This crisis of imprisonment is tied to another massive obstacle facing the United States, that of its racial divide. Now, before proceeding, it has been overwhelmingly proven that the only race is human, and entering into any discussion on that topic is an exercise in vanity. Yet, while the American concept of race is an artificial one, because it is perceived by many Americans, it does play a role in the culture of that society and must enter into any discussion of their country. Because darker-skinned residents of the United States tend to be disproportionately poor, they are likewise disproportionately affected by the Americans' excesses in their policy of large-scale imprisonment of the poor. Unfortunately, the United States had a long history in that regard, starting from its origins as a state in which a significant portion of the economy was built on the labors of enslaved Africans. Even after the ostensible overturning of the abomination of slavery, ostensible because in many places in the United States prisoners are put to work, often for profit, which is allowable under the 13th Amendment to that country's constitution. The African American, a silly term as all humanity originates from the Rift Valley in Africa, the African American community often faced severe repressions. From the black codes implemented in the legal charters of many states, such as Mississippi, to vigilante actions and the depredations of the Ku Klux Klan, to exclusion from workplaces, to poverty and social breakdown, the descendants of Africans in the United States have faced grim hardships. And as this community is disproportionately poor, disproportionately imprisoned, or disproportionately enlisted, a great divide remains. Nor is that community the only one to face a greater burden in the United States. In some cases enslaved, the indigenous nations to the territory of the United States face wholesale expropriation of their land, and in some cases outright massacre. Following the expansion into lands once held by Spain, the new Spanish-speaking and Chicano residents were marginalized, a legacy which reverberates today in today's scaremongering over immigration. The Chinese community in the United States was met with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And while in the aftermath of these misdeeds, working men and women of the various races in America bicker and snap at each other over crumbs, at best their plight ignored, at worst become a source of amusement and profit to the oligarchical class. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, from his banishment, wrote that there is no evil in poverty, as anyone knows who has not yet arrived at the lunatic stage of greed and luxury. I know that I have not lost wealth but distractions. The body's needs are few. It wants but to be free from cold, to banish hunger and thirst with nourishment. If we long for anything more, we are exerting ourselves to serve our vices, not our needs. But denied these needs, longing becomes a pain, of which rage and hate are a form. And indeed, it is doubtful that one may be truly satisfied with having his needs met when above him an oligarch in an ivory tower not only gorges himself on the fruits of other men's labors, but decides whether one may even be permitted to labor. It would be unfair to state that the United States is without its virtues. The state's commitment to certain principles, such as freedom of speech and of the press, are admirable, even if not perfectly applied. But because of their imperfections in application, because the poor are being crushed and their voices unheard, the American empire is drawing to a crossroads. So long as meaningful speech remains a commodity that is unaffordable for the many, so long as the masses have no real impact on policy, any potential the American state has to improve its conduct towards its own people, let alone to others, will never be realized. As things are, the state has failed, at least on Ciceronian terms. It will continue to fail, to decline, until its people have had enough, or until it simply fades into obscurity.